They will, you understand, they will...
Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me properly? Good afternoon. My name is Yuri Sadala. I work for the Norwegian Refugee Council. I'd like to apologize to the translator already for my thick French accent, which I can't do anything about. I've been requested to chair this panel, and I have three things which make me very happy about it. The first thing is that our first reaction was that it's a daunting task, always a daunting task to chair a panel right after lunch. But I'm very pleased to see that so many of you are still with us. So that's the first thing. The second aspect for me was a great honor. A great honor to be surrounded by these panelists around me. Mr. D'Angelo, with the head of the international relation team for the Italian Department of Civil Protection, honored us with his presence, and that's great, not the least as he has to deal with a situation in Genoa, I understand. So great thank you to you for being with us, that's much appreciated. Further on my right-hand side, my friend and colleague Dominic Crowley from Concern Worldwide. Dominic is the emergency director for Concern. And on my left, all of you, I presume Marco Rotelli, who is the Secretary General of Intersource. So that's and a great host. So big thank you on behalf of the Voice Board. And the final my third reaction when being asked to chair that panel is a reaction of pleasure. Pleasure first because it's an opportunity to unpack some of the issues which we have been discussing this morning. Some of the issues, especially Catherine mentioned, when it comes to some, I would say, technical language about comprehensive approach, about I would say, very lively discussion we've been having on humanitarian principles, about civil protection. I believe this is our chance to go a bit further on those issues with our panelists. I was very pleased because it's a great title. I don't know if you recall the title of this session, but it's called Greater Needs, Closer Collaboration. And why it's a great title is, for me, first, it's because greater needs, we've been hearing about them all this morning. And I think the best summary was the remark of the Vice Minister in his opening remark when he stated that this year is an annus horribilis. I think it's difficult to summarize it better. Annus horribilis over the world. I won't mention all these crises. We are all involved in one way or another to responding to the needs. But then the second part of the title is collaboration, and I'm sure you have noted that there's a question mark about it, and you may wonder why. My kind of interpretation of this question mark is very much along the line Catherine strong statement this morning when she mentioned that coordinated with others, absolutely, of course, yes. That's intuitive. We need to collaborate more when there's so much needs out there, but not to be coordinated by others as humanitarian agencies, as humanitarian NGOs. And I believe that's the key. That's the key perspective we need to keep in mind and to ensure that us, as NGOs, we are able to do our work. So with that in mind, this is very much the perspective I would invite the panelists to keep with them while engaging in that discussion. So against this background, just in a nutshell, the intention is to have a lively exchange. So I will invite each panelist, starting with Mr. D'Angelo, to make 5 minutes general remark on how they see these issues from their point of view. I'll be a bit ruthless with the time frame as we have a quite packed agenda. And then the intention would be to have exchange and questions. I will use the privilege of being the chair to ask questions for 15-20 minute session before opening up to you and to the floor for further questioning. So that's the format. Then I stop there and by stating that there are many collaborations we can think of in our line of work. Many actors, many stakeholders we are engaging on a regular basis with. Here, what we would, the three key kind of engagements we would like to discuss is the one with civil protection actors, certainly an important dimension. Collaboration with foreign policies, forces, which obviously impacts a lot of day-to-day work. And finally, the whole military collaboration, which is something also which raises a lot of questions. I stop here and would invite Mr. D'Angelo to give us your perspective.
Thank you very much, Yuri. I'm very, very pleased to be here because for us this semester is quite challenging upon this topic. As Vice Minister Pistelli said this morning, it's one of our priority to investigate, to look into possible further cooperation among two families, humanitarian aid and civil protection. So this occasion to exchange, to look into common views for us, for me, is very interesting, and for the colleagues from civil protection that are here since this morning. When we approach to this topic, I would say that one of the main issues, which will be even reflected on a policy paper that we are preparing in close cooperation with Mario Baldi, who is leading the part of humanitarian aid within this semester of Presidency of Council of European Union. When we face this problem, this topic, the main finding was maybe we have to enhance a common knowledge, a common understanding of each other. I admit that civil protection operators, not everybody, but many of them are not properly aware about humanitarian principles that are based upon your actions. And on the other side, not everybody from the humanitarian know what is the civil protection. And the perception of civil protection is sometimes not appropriate as it is. I would just say that in Italy, the civil protection is a service provided to the citizen by a multiple panel of actors. It is stated by law. Our department is within the cabinet office of the Premier, and it is the main mandate is provide general strategy, coordination in case of a natural disaster, big disaster in our country. So we are very much focused on the issues that happen in our country, of course. The system has been built upon the experience gained in Italy, upon the many disasters that we lived in. And I would say that we developed a knowledge and know-how on facing disasters that has been, in several occasions, been brought abroad. And we have been requested by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, and in close cooperation with them, to provide assistance overseas. So the point is, how do we foresee this exchange? How do we foresee this cooperation? It should not be, in my opinion, in my understanding, a cooperation at any cost, because we are based on different kind of legal basis, and we are operating on different kind of approach. But we are fully convinced that there are fields in which the two families can look into synergies and can face the same situation in a complementarity and in close cooperation. Coming back to the Italian civil protection, of course, we have an approach that I would define as an inclusive approach. For us, Red Cross, like defense, like military, of course, volunteers, organization of civil protection are integral part of the system, and we cooperate in Italy with them very well. I would say that we even exported this model outside in situation in which for natural disaster, the complete system has been transferred there. I just would like to mention the Haiti case that is in the memory of anybody here, I'm sure, in which maybe you saw civil protection people arriving there and pretending, maybe I would say, to coordinate, but was not our mission, was not our aim. We are mobilized upon a Council of Ministers decree that is issued either for natural disasters at home, or for in Italy, or for disaster abroad. So there is a Council of Ministers that decided that the civil protection system has to be mobilized. And that was the occasion of Haiti or the Philippines or wherever. But when we move, of course, under certain circumstances and within a certain framework. For us, United Nations is the coordinating agency, the coordinated body for any kind of action that we do. So our aim is to cooperate, is to provide a service, but not to coordinate. Of course, in Italy, we coordinate. We coordinate our assets. We have a clear mandate to provide strategy and to optimize the use of resources that are available within the system, provided by a multiple panel of actors. So we have a coordinating mandate in Italy, and we coordinate the assets abroad that we brought in the country, not of course the assets belonging to other actors. But the time is quite short. I just wanted to quickly give you a very initial and brief overview of what is the civil protection system in Italy, and then I pass the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rodri. Much appreciated for the content and for the timekeeping on both accounts. Many questions we can already think of from your presentation. Haiti is a perfect example. I would also be interested to hear later on your views on civil protection involvement in countries where you have both disasters and conflict, where maybe some of the issues at hand are more acute. But let's park that for the time being, and I move on to Marco. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuri. I had not a presentation, but something in mind before coming here today, and then listening all the morning few interventions and aspect that has been raised. I have changed it completely. So if you excuse me, I will probably try to put some points for reflections rather than let's say a normal or flowing presentation, because I don't want to be redundant and I want to take some of the inputs that have been developed this morning. The point is, I've been asked at the beginning to reflect a little bit on civil protection and military in their relation with humanitarian. So, of course, at the beginning, when I saw the title, I say, look, the military is not the civil protection. So how can I compare the two and then to relate to our world, if it is our world and exclusively our world as humanitarian, or if it's more complex and open to other actors and so on. And then in the end I said, okay, we have been struggling for many years with a very sharp idea and even tools, Oslo guidelines, MCDA, all the guidelines made and set up to regulate somehow the relation between humanitarians and the military, and with probably, at least in my experience, a lot of talks in the offices in Europe especially, and a very difficult implementation of what was in principle somehow agreed or left to individual interpretation during the meetings on the ground. So in the end, there were moments in which we have mentioned the Lebanon issues, for instance, this morning and so, but the relation is still very difficult, although there are tools adopted, there are tools that the international community ideally adopts. If you then move the reflection to the civil protection, my first thinking is, they are different from the military, but still is something that is a little bit external to the pure humanitarian mindset. And when we're talking about humanitarian in the broad sense, we cannot only think to big structured organization. You represent NRC, they're representing concern here, so well-established, known, reputed organization. There are also all the scale, the spectrum of NGOs, so-called humanitarian. You see in the the media now, everyone that has been even abducted in some areas of the world is a humanitarian, if he's not a military or a journalist. So, and I say, okay, what are the level of engagement we can have with the civil protection? We as Intersos, we had, I would say, in the last at least 5 years, not to go too much. We had several experiences, and I would take two as not opposite but different scenarios. One has been mentioned right now, Haiti, And another one is less known because it was a smaller operation and it was within a crisis already ongoing, a protracted crisis in Afghanistan. So Haiti, Intersos and many other organizations were jumping there, rushing to an extreme crisis, extreme sudden natural event, and many other actors, including the Italian Civil Protection, came there. So a lot of confusions, a lot of misunderstanding of who is doing what, who has what is the agenda of each actor. In the end, we found our way to collaborate. Not everything was smooth and nice and things, but in the end, we got what we needed, basically items, tents, if I remember at the time, and we got also some advices on how to reshape some of the things that we thought as humanitarian we were very good to do, but in in camp settlements and so on, they had also some very good advices and so on. In Afghanistan was the other, let's say, the other spectrum of the issue. Time to prepare and to take profit of the excellent in that experiment, in that test, capacity to train our staff from the Italian Civil Protection with one but very excellent university department to then implement as humanitarian without any, let's say, contamination, if you want to call it provocatively, from the civil protection in Afghanistan, which is already a very, very sensitive environment where military, of course, PRTs and whatever this word invented is basically present and active. And so two different. And in my opinion, these two examples, I picked these two because you can somehow already state if you prepare things, if you work and you do your homeworks, then you can deliver. If you don't, if you just jump there, and not only the civil protection, NGOs too, then you can really have some problems. The other thing is normally we tend to distinguish to separate into natural disaster and conflicts. Of course, in natural disaster, everything in principle is easier. Okay, welcome the military, welcome the civil protection. We have no problems. Now, in this moment, the crisis we are facing in this moment, I think the complexity of complex crises, it's something that has mixed up and created more problems than we had. So, shall we, as a humanitarian, now protect ourselves from the military and also from the civil protection, or are we in this moment obliged to engage with them, doing the homeworks and doing the preparation of everything? I think it should be, in principle, far easier with the civil protection. They have, of course, and as Luigi has pretty well stated, a political mandate directly coming from the Premier Office in Italy, but they also are civilians. So in principle, there are less problems. So there is time to discuss, although, again, the two examples should be kept in mind. Last 30 seconds. You are ruthless, you say. The complexity of the modern crisis, and again, in the complex crisis, we say in jargon, so where a natural disaster strikes on a conflict or vice versa, and the inclusion of these different actors from the purely humanitarian, or purely what is called to be purely humanitarian, brings the fact that we need to engage more with the international humanitarian law. If you engage with military in Lebanon, it may be something pretty easy to do. If you engage with a belligerent part in a country where your government is a belligerent and has a civil protection department and has a military department, a PRT, a humanitarian action, and so on, you are really walking on a thin line where the IHL must be taken in consideration. And normally, at least Italian NGOs, let's say, not to take you on are not really well trained in IHL. So it's a little bit now also in the hands and the tables of the NGOs to ensure that they have this humanitarian capacity and this they can be called literally humanitarian, because we risk to be also the enemy of ourselves somehow, not being fully and legitimately humanitarian. That's all I can say in 5 minutes.
Thanks a lot. It's a lot in 5 minutes, so that's impressive. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Marco. I like many of the points you made, especially, I must say, the self-critical dimension you brought to it. You mentioned families. We have maybe two families, but also it's important that we look at our own and try to be better. And let me confirm to you that Italian NGOs are not the only one to not be sufficiently aware of AHL. I can confirm that already. Moving on to an Irish NGO, Dominic. Dominic, please, floor is yours.
I'm not an Irish NGO in and of myself, but I do work for one. Thank you, Yuri. I've been asked to speak about two issues, the NGO concerns regarding engagement with the military and with civil protection. Either of these could take us several days to talk about, so I will try to be as brief as I can and to pick up on some of the comments of both Luigi and Marco. Sorry, I'll shout a bit more, shall I? At least I have a voice, it often disappears. As an organisation, Concern has lots of experience of engaging with military and a wide range of different military actors, whether they're national or international or regional forces. And the types of engagement that we've had with them has been very different. So if you take a simple example like Pakistan, 2005, you had the earthquake. The Pakistani troops were incredibly engaged, incredibly supportive of the aid response. I remember going into Muzaffarabad in the middle of Ramadan, middle of the afternoon. The troops had just finished putting together a camp, and they said, this is it, we put the camp, we can accommodate so many people, this is the design, we've put the latrines and the bathrooms over in the far corner so the smell won't affect people. And we said, well, that's not the way we design camps for the last 10 years because of security, particularly of women and girls going to use the toilets at night. We cluster them around small areas of shelter. They said, fine. They demolished the whole camp and they redesigned it the same day. And this was a military force that really their engagement with the NGOs had been very, very difficult up until then. So 2005, very positive experience. 2010 came along. You had the Swat Valley offensive going on, you had 2 million people displaced, and then you had the flooding. And the military turned to the NGOs and said, we've got a good experience of working with you in the past, we want to work with you now. And they couldn't understand when the NGOs turned around and said, well, no, we don't want to work with you. You're now a belligerent to the conflict, you're fighting the conflict in Swat Valley. If we work with you, we become seen as being party to the military and we become legitimate targets in the minds and the eyes of the Taliban. Pakistani Taliban. And getting that message across about the need for distinction and separation was very, very difficult. It came on the back of everything that had been happening in Afghanistan, and we've talked already about the PRTs. Would they always wear uniform? Would they always carry weapons? How do you have a distinction if you have a soldier in civilian clothing carrying weapons, delivering what they deem to be an aid program, and an aid worker? What's the difference? How do people know? And this lack of distinction, this blurring of the lines of distinction between the military forces and the aid workers, we felt contributed to the pattern of attacks and the normalization of that pattern of attacks against aid workers that has become worse and worse over the last few decades. The situation in terms of our security is becoming ever more difficult. And if you look at the analysis that's been done of what's been called the militarized aid projects, both by the ENNA, the UK Royal Military Academy, and by Tufts, they're all saying that these militarized aid projects fail. They fail because they become increasingly targeted, because they're seen as part of a wider military agenda. What was happening is that the military were using quick impact projects to fund interventions that were about building hearts and minds, getting support from communities, and gathering intelligence from communities to support their military activities. And so aid agencies that became involved in those sorts of programs in support of the military became disproportionately targeted. So the choices that we make, the behavior of individual organizations affect the global reputation or the national reputation of all organizations and can increase the pattern of attacks. So you can say as an organization individually that you have good practice with regard to separation from the military. But if an NGO in the neighboring district is behaving in an inappropriate way, you become more at risk. I was going to talk about South Sudan, but I've just got a 1-minute warning from Yuri. So let me just pick up on Luigi's comments about civil protection and profess that I am amongst that group that is largely ignorant of civil protection. Ireland has a very strong reputation of engaging with UN peacekeepers. We're one of the few European countries that consistently sends troops. We have no reputation or no engagement of civil protection. So for an Irish NGO, our view of civil protection is that it's a governmental mechanism. It may be civilian, but it's still governmental and therefore can't properly be deemed to be humanitarian in nature. We consider them probably to be proto-military. Maybe they're going around in some kind of uniform, maybe they're not, maybe we don't really know. We don't know when they deploy, we don't know who asks them to deploy. We don't know if they follow the MCDA and Oslo guidelines on the ground. We don't know whether they engage with the cluster systems or not. We don't know how long they stay. I had an occasion a number of years ago when, just to sort of try to relate some of the work that I know civil protection to, a US colonel working in Afghanistan phoned me in Dublin and said, "We've just finished building a clinic and we want to give it to an NGO to take it over and manage it. Will you do that for us?" I sat there going, crap, how do I respond to that? I said, well, really, no, we can't. It's not the way that we work. We don't generally build infrastructure. We're trying to look at the capacity of governments and building that capacity. And so if civil protection mechanisms are largely looking at putting in infrastructure to hand over, how easy is that going to be as a process? These are some of the concerns that, from my ill-informed or completely uninformed perspective, that I would have as a representative of an Irish NGO relative to civil protection. And I'd be very happy to be proven wrong on all those things.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dominic. Not the least for your confession, which I may actually do myself. I know little, but hopefully by the end of this session, thanks to Luigi, we'll know a lot more on civil protection. But before going there on the civil protection specifically, I would like to ask a question to the panelists when it comes to the principles. We've been hearing about them a lot this morning. From your point of view, in your various capacities, and maybe my colleagues from the NGO one, is it still possible to actually have a principled, needs-based approach in the context we are operating in? Think Pakistan. You cast Pakistan as a simple example. I may have an issue with that. But, think Iraq, think Afghanistan, and other contexts. Is it still possible? And if so, how do you deal with these principles from your respective point of view? And as an add-on question to it, how can we, as humanitarian actor, who I would assume believe in these principles, that we don't become instrumentalized by foreign policy forces? What's the recipe? If Marco, you may want to start. And I will invite Dominic.
Well, the answer in Italian would be ni, means yes and no. It's a sort of mix. It's purely Italian, culturally Italian approved. But yes and no, because it depends really and very much by the rules of engagement. It depends very much on the environment. It depends very much on the behavior of actors. It depends very much on how much you have prepared and you are aware of the risks of instrumentalization. In principle, I would say it is extremely difficult not by let's say ideological aversion to the engagement with the military. We have tried it and it has proved to be extremely difficult in almost any circumstance. Okay, so we need really to go then to the practice to say, okay, is it possible or not, and we have to take a decision. And again, I'm not referring to just to natural disasters. I'm referring with the current context and set of complex crises. So let's forget for a while the simple case of a flood in a peaceful remote area of a Pacific island with everybody happy and just in need of a little bit of help. The world we are working in is completely different. With the civil protection, in principle, it would be easier, but then we also have to understand one thing. The environment we are working in are not an academia. So the persons that are involved in the conflicts and in the natural disaster, in the crisis, are there and are watching, and they don't have neither the time nor the inclination or, the education, the capacity, the cultural, openness to distinguish to small details. Is the car white? Is the car a UN blue or black flag of stickers? Is the military behaving according to the Oslo guidelines or not? The level, there are areas, we were talking about Afghanistan, in Western Afghanistan, the Italians are the Italians. So it's a mixed vision, basically pretending on unbalance on the military side, because they are the overwhelming, let's say, presence, more visible, more powerful, more convincing than the other. So it's impossible to say yes or no. Again, depends on the context and depends on how basically you behave and you prepare.
So ni. Okay. Thank you for that. Dominic.
Sadly, we don't have ni in either English or in Irish. If we don't have principles, what do we have? We need to have principles. We need to stand for something. And the 4 core humanitarian principles, while they're not universally understood or universally agreed within even the Western NGO communities, are probably the best articulation of what we should be doing. So yes, I think we can have it, and I think we should have it. There was a question 5 or 6 years ago to say, are the principles still relevant in a context where we're being increasingly targeted for attack? Should we abandon them? Should we stop trying to be neutral? Should we start taking sides? To me, it's all a load of rubbish. Now more than ever, we need to have the principles and we need to live the principles. There's no point signing up to them and saying, I'm a humanitarian organization, I believe in these core principles, and then not delivering on them. One of the things that we do, or we try to do, and we do it unevenly, but we do it better in the more insecure contexts, is to make sure that all of our staff can explain who concern is, what we do, and what our principles are. And that's going back to what Marco is saying. It's using language that they can understand and that they can use. It's the elevator speech. How can you describe in 1 minute what your organization is about? And if all your staff can't do that clearly in their own languages, then you have a problem. So it's something we've worked on. It's very uneven. Avoiding being instrumentalized was your second nice, easy question, Yuri. I think there's a difference, and we've had this argument in the past with USAID when I've met with them, that we say that you're biased in your aid, you give a disproportionate amount of aid to countries that would support the interests of your foreign policy. And they said, yeah, fine, but name one emergency that we haven't funded. So we always point the finger at USAID, but they're still the largest single donor to emergency response. I think the challenge for us really, though, is, are we delivering programs that are based on needs assessment? Are we actually being impartial in the design and delivery of our interventions? This is a core principle that we're supposed to adhere to. Or are we being increasingly driven by donor demands and where the donors are putting the money? Are we chasing the money that's available? And if we're increasingly doing that, what does that mean in terms of our impartiality? And it's an unfortunate reality of the current economic climate that I think many organizations, and I'd include ourselves in that, are looking more and more to where the donors want to fund and less to where we maybe would prefer to work. So I think there is a huge challenge. But I think there's also a challenge that needs to be understood, that the motivations for donors to give money and the reasons why we would program it may not be the same. Donors may give it to sort of further their political security objectives, but if we're actually doing proper needs assessments on the ground and we're delivering programs that are designed to target the most vulnerable and the most affected populations, to me that's not being instrumentalized. That's delivering aid in an appropriate manner in an insecure context.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dominic. Luigi, on this question of needs space, yeah.
And I just would like to step in only to mention something. First of all, I hope that Dominic will come home understanding with a clear view in his mind that in Italy civil protection is not military. So I hope that...
It's a proto-military.
Neither that. No, on the... need-based approach, I just would like to add a very few sentences on this. We are very far from the times when we brought our staff in our backyard and bring them to another country in case of emergency. We are very far from there. Our intervention is based on real needs approach, but just I would like to mention what is our way of engagement. We usually intervene upon the European mechanism of civil protection. How it is activated? It is activated by the local authority that are affected. So need-based approach of, okay, is not coming from people, is coming, the needs are coming from the authorities. And this is one thing that I can agree upon when you say, okay, it's not a real need-based approach from the communities. But nowadays, the reform of European mechanism of civil protection foresee that the UN agency can activate the mechanism. And the real needs and the list of needs is provided by them, by UN agencies. So, and I guess they, of course, work on a need-based approach. So please consider this. Our level of engagement is no more, as many years ago, to take what you have in the garage and bring them somewhere because there is a disaster. It's very much based on the needs, I guess.
Thank you, Luigi. Thanks a lot. And on the same question of civil protection, I think it's very valid, your point on this activation being held by the UN system. I also recall situations where it hasn't been activated, despite a lot of discussions, especially Libya, a few years ago. Just wanted to challenge you a bit on the perception. The word perception came several times in Marco's and Dominic intervention. Not knowing very much civil protection myself, my kind of image is the protection actors with uniforms. In a conflict zone, that may somehow blur the lines. How do you handle that? And in the same vein, what would be the comparative advantage of civil protection versus NGOs like ourselves, delivering, as we heard this morning, 60 to 70% of the entire humanitarian aid? What's your comparative advantage? And yeah.
Thank you, Yuri. I'm glad to respond to that. We do not step in a conflict area. That's mandatory for us. We don't go in a conflict area. For us, at least as Italian civil protection system, we don't step in. What we do in certain circumstances is to intervene in complex situations. I can just refer to the case of Jordania in 2011, 2012. We, under the, let's say, in coordination with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we just provided a sort of expertise, an asset of civil protection in terms of health assistance in the refugee camps. And namely in the Azraq camp in Jordan, we built an infrastructure, but it was not an infrastructure like a road. It was just an health facility in a refugee camp. That facility has been then delivered, has been handed over to Red Cross societies that are now managing that under the finance of DG ECHO. So again, it's a very good example for me of complementarity. And we didn't build a road just for that and give them to somebody, but it was a specific plan, a specific complex. On the second issue, I just would like to mention that my experience in Haiti was very clear in this sense. We wouldn't have distributed just one tent, we wouldn't have been able to distribute one only tent if we didn't try to enter the country through you. That's what we did. We request to the different NGOs that were there, that were even well established there, that were indicated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we approached to them requesting a specific project. Upon that, we could give tents, and we could even support them in building the camps. And in that sense, for me was really clear that there is a way to enter, apart from the perception. And was even clear the example of US Army distributing food in Port-au-Prince. They, when it happened, they just closed any road and you saw a lot of confusion, but they were distributing food, even militarizing somehow. What we did is to enter some of the slums with our military, because you know in Haiti an aircraft carrier Cavu came in bringing 1,000 military, and I would just give the example and then we can reflect upon that. But what we did is to enter the most inaccessible areas through the NGOs that were working there from years, distributing tent, building the camps with the military that went there in uniforms, having, and I don't want to go too much further, I don't want to look as a visionary, but they had a humanitarian perception, not a military perception, because people accepted them, understanding the way why they were there, because the key of access was humanitarian.
Thanks a lot for these clarifications and answers. Then I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. We would like to challenge our panelists. I hope you got coffee. I have one from Catherine here. Yeah.
Thank you. I find it very interesting, this exchange, and I would just like to ask, because during the Italian presidency now, you have launched this paper to create synergies between humanitarian aid and civil protection. And I come from the north of Europe, and I know that civil protection is functioning differently. I mean, the objective is the same, but the way it's organized, the way it's engaging outside or not in Europe is different. So there is a big diversity in Europe about how civil protection is conceived or visible, even if the objectives are everywhere the same. Now, it is mainly on the European level that you launch. So I would be very interested whether your good experience, collaboration with Italian NGOs, is something you expect all over Europe. The Red Cross is already engaged because they are part of the civil protection in the different European states. So I think one question, kind of, how do you think to multiply, because you say very clearly you don't go to conflict. Okay. But when it comes to complex emergencies, like in Pakistan, the example Dominic brought, there was a conflict and there was a flood. And we will have more and more of these situations. I also hear that there is civil protection now on the way to Ukraine. I think that's a very clear conflict, and these are EU missions, and you are part in that. It would be interesting to hear, in a way, and also maybe from the NGOs, could you imagine to kind of collaborate in a complex emergency with civil protection, which works in the way Mr. Angelo talks about? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I suggest taking a few questions. Yes, please.
Se mettete le cuffie, perché parlerò in italiano. Vorrei davvero che prendessimo l'occasione qui in Italia, da questo incontro, per davvero sederci intorno a un tavolo, protezione civile e ONG, e valutare le esperienze di questi anni. Ci sono state cose molto positive, ci sono state cose limitate, forse anche qualcosa di negativo, come ogni realtà, perciò nulla di speciale. Però le abbiamo lasciate, le abbiamo accantonate, non abbiamo approfondito. Secondo me, partendo da queste iniziative, penso che il link potrebbe essere davvero disponibile a questo confronto, dobbiamo riflettere. Parlo dell'esperienza positiva. C'è stata la guerra in Kosovo, i profughi sono fuggiti in Albania, la protezione civile è stata molto presente. L'esperienza nostra, e l'abbiamo guardata e apprezzata tantissimo, è stata che la protezione civile nazionale ha detto: alla Protezione Civile di Milano, che voleva fare qualcosa, andate coordinati da Intersos, perché Intersos era presente, conosceva le persone, conosceva le popolazioni, era fuggito coi kosovari in Albania e poi è rientrato coi kosovari in Kosovo, e la Protezione Civile di Milano è stata felice di essere, perché non conosceva l'ambiente, di essere coordinata. Ed è stato un progetto straordinario. Allora, non sempre è necessario che ci sia la soggettività della Protezione Civile che fa qualcosa in collaborazione con... Probabilmente si possono creare sinergie fin dall'inizio e chi più conosce il terreno, chi più conosce la realtà, diventa il soggetto che coordina. Certe volte sarà la Protezione Civile, certe volte sarà l'ONG, senza avere sempre la voglia di dire è la mia bandiera che... faccio quell'esempio lì, non parlo degli esempi più limitanti, più limitati, più negativi, che quello farà parte della discussione che dobbiamo avere. E questo è la Protezione Civile. Sui militari, io sono anch'io del parere che il sì e no non è rispetto ai principi che sono comunque la nostra guida. I principi devono guidarci assolutamente. E quando la presenza o la collaborazione con i militari può mettere in discussione la nostra imparzialità nella distribuzione degli aiuti, nella presenza, o la nostra stessa identità, e allora il rapporto con i militari non ci vuole proprio. Lì non c'è, sono d'accordo, non c'è sì e no. Ma non era questo che intendeva Marco, ovviamente. Anzi, molto spesso, anzi talvolta, noi dovremo dire in quell'area non intervengo perché sarebbe troppo ambiguo e sarebbe anche negativo per me stesso, organizzazione umanitaria. Cioè avere il coraggio di dire non intervengo perché la presenza dei militari potrebbe mettere in discussione la mia stessa presenza.
Thank you. Grazie. Grazie mille. Any third question for our panelists before I ask them to reply? No, maybe let me ask a third one to you then. I've learned the concept of ni earlier in this intervention. It resonates in my ears as the concept, the outgoing commissioner for humanitarian aid, Kristalina Georgieva, mantra over the last few years, which is the in but out. I don't know how much you're familiar with it, but it was linked to the question of comprehensive approach and the whole idea of humanitarian aid linking up with over foreign policy tools, instruments, but without being totally being instrumentalized. And I would like to get the views of our panelists on that aspect as well. Is it something you believe should be continued, perpetuated with the new leadership at the EU level? Do you foresee some sort of a risk of this doctrine to be challenged in the years to come? I stop there and ask Luigi to maybe pick up on the questions on the protection side.
Yeah. For civil protection, to say in but out is almost impossible. Because, I mean, if we want to provide a relief, a concrete relief, we have to be there. So I think that the most tricky situation for us is to be there in certain circumstances where we should not be. I mean, I can give you my personal view on Ukraine, but I would say that it's quite tricky that the European Civil Protection Mechanism has been activated for Ukraine. Italy is not contributed, but there is not necessarily a policy view behind that. I mean, if we would have been able to be, maybe a contribution can be given, but there are situations where I think it's not appropriate that civil protection steps in. Can be different for Pakistan. For Pakistan, because in 2005 there was a big flood, there was a real need of having health assets distributed all over the country. What we did was just provided tents to the authorities, to the local authorities, in order for them to use in the country and distribute them. But we really put very much attention to the places where we can go and where we cannot go. Honestly, we base our approach on the safety and security of our operators. We do not base our approach on respecting or not humanitarian principles. This is the reality. I mean, I have to be honest. But it's again part of our common knowledge and common understanding, because as long as civil protection base their approach even on humanitarian principles, not only on safety and security of the operators, maybe things can work better, in my understanding and in my opinion. And of course, there are situations in which we clearly can work and can be in and can provide a clear assistance in complementarity with what is going on.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Luigi. Marco.
Yeah, to me the risk is to put two different, let's say 2 or 3 if you include the military, but for the military it's probably easier. 2 different animals, humanitarians and the civil protection, and think that they are overlapping somehow the same thing and so on. These 2 words are 2 different mandated entities with let's say in 2 circles with a little part overlapping of competencies, of goals or objectives and so on. So in my opinion, the reasons to be natural allied, and I think the paper talks in these terms, to natural allied is in that little overlap area, and for the activities and in the circumstances not let's say compromising, of course, principles, humanitarian conduct and so on. Where it is compromising, of course, no way to collaborate. But where is never compromising, probably in principle, again in the preparedness, in the things that you can do at home. There is plenty of know-how, expertise, centers for research and so on. And we are paying as citizens, as taxpayers, for these normally these services, this elaboration of this research. And it will be stupid in a way to renounce it ideologically, especially when at home, let's say, is not compromising. The point is, you can't take this concept valid, let's say, for everything, because then in a regime of lack of resources that is becoming a little bit, it has been probably the 7th year now of saying crisis, saying we are in lack of resources. Then you cannot abdicate or renounce to the let's say protection of the humanitarian space because of the lack of resources. There is a ceiling of where the collaboration is absolutely not is impossible. But let's say it is still possible, in my opinion, where it is no compromises. And again, it can be no compromises in the field, but I don't see lots of problems in the collaboration at home.
Thank you, Marco. Before inviting you for any final burning questions, floor is yours, Dominic. Especially on the comprehensive approach, maybe, and your take on the in but out doctrine.
Shaking it all about. Just maybe very quickly to go back to Nino's question, which was very passionately delivered. I think if we withdrew from every country in which there was an international military force present, we would be withdrawing from a lot of countries, and there'd be a huge amount of unmet need. It's always the question of balancing the security or insecurity of your staff, the differentiation and distinction with the military. I think your question is very interesting, but I think it's an enormously difficult proposal. In terms of the in and out, I gave a presentation a couple of years ago to a COHAFA meeting in Dublin, and I said that at times I think the NGO community think that they are something like Jose Mourinho, former Inter Milan manager. When he first went to Chelsea, he gave a press conference saying, "I am the special one," and we think we're special, we think we're different, we think we have this absolute right to dictate to everybody what they can do and what they can't do. And that, as with Mourinho, everyone else gets pissed off with us because we keep sticking to these principles and saying we're special, we're different, you must treat us differently, you must exclude us from every process. So when the European External Action Services were being set up, ECHO was kept outside of that process for the very reasons that we've talked about, this need for the specific nature of humanitarian aid, the need for distinction, the need for needs-based programming. But if you look at what's happening with the comprehensive approach, and you're following what's been going on in the States, Hillary Clinton's 3D model, and in a number of individual member states within Europe, is this pulling humanitarian aid into a wider security development agenda by stealth? Are we being taken in against our wishes and contrary to Lisbon and contrary to the structure whereby ECHO is outside of EEAS? If it happens, is humanitarian aid going to end up as it is largely in the States, where it sits under the Department of Defense? For a lot of the activities, the State Department really controls most of it. Are we going to end up having ECHO's programming instrumentalized towards the achievement of a European foreign policy? If that happens, what does that mean in terms of where the aid is being directed? Is it going to go more and more to countries that are serving or in which Europe has a specific security interest? Are we going to get less and less needs-based programming? Are we going to have a greater attack on aid workers? For me, the challenges of the comprehensive approach are huge. And you can understand why ECHO says we need to be out of it. It's the bit where we need to be in it that I struggle with. Yes, you need dialogue. Yes, you need engagement. But should you have structural inclusion or should you have structural exclusion? Which would be my sort of slightly naive, no doubt, view on life.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominic. We have actually, time is flying. We have only time for one kind of last final question, if any. One from Nicola. I hope it's not about football and Jose Mourinho's attitude.
No, hello? Yeah. No, it won't be. Very briefly, I was last year on a panel with Commissioner Georgieva and the President of the ICRC on values and humanitarian principles and things. And I asked the audience at one moment, what in your view is the most common ingredient of conflicts and situations with high political tensions? And I got all sorts of answers, hatred, and said, no, it's no, 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 no. I said, the most common ingredient to a crisis situation or a conflict situation is suspicion. Suspicion. And these principles are an answer to suspicion. If you arrive as an outsider in a conflict situation, you are immediately and automatically and legitimately suspected of being, oh, he must have a hidden agenda. He must be working for the enemy. Why would he come? So you must answer the case for suspicion. And this is why we have these principles. Now, this being said, and I have 30 seconds, I want to go along the lines of the Jose Mourinho thing, all the same. Humanitarian intervention is not the panacea of humanity. It was said this morning, Marco, you said it. There is no pretense to be the panacea. You know, or it is not the only form of solidarity. There are other forms of solidarity, which in some circumstances are much more effective. And so we have no, we cannot corner the market of values in that sense. But the point is, again, to listen to these very interesting interventions, what Luigi D'Angelo says, you know, I mean, again, for civilian protection, neutrality does not need to be a value. Who would be we to ask civilian protection? They don't care. They don't need to care. In Italy, in Genoa, tonight, tomorrow, there is no need for these values. So these values are purely operational issues in certain circumstances. And what I gather from this very interesting panel is that there is no rule. There is no rule. But we must always, what really needs to be done is to answer the question of suspicion. If in a given circumstances, the risk of suspicion is there, and very typically in Ukraine it is, very typically, it should not be done. It is a mistake. It's ultimately a political mistake. It's going to have this type of effect. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas, for your comment / conclusion. Marco,
really a 15 seconds remark. I think that anyway, engagement between humanitarian and civil protection, I mean, or the invitation to civil protection in the humanitarian domain is there to stay. And we are not able, at least we didn't demonstrate to be able to control it or to refuse it. The DG ECO is called DG ECO for humanitarian and civil protection. So at that point, what we probably could ask, and maybe rightly, is there is no need to be, as NGO, to be coordinated or to be involved through institutions. The civil protection can actually engage also directly with us or invite us in a tripartite, let's say, table in order to exchange view and so on. And of course, institutions talks with institutions. That's normal. We don't we don't have the right probably to, but we can influence. We can provide advice. We can provide our perspective, and I think it's an enrichment. Then you take it or you leave it.
Thank you, Marco. Luigi.
Very short, just to reply to Nino Sergi. Of course, we are available to any kind of follow-up on this possibility, and we even welcome the presence of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs in order to triangulate this issue. And I just would like to advocacy on one thing. It's reflected in the paper. There is one of the fields of possible cooperation, which is building capacity on disaster relief. We all saw in Haiti that one of the main point of crisis of the international community trying to providing help was that on the other side there was nobody saying what are the needs, because everything was almost collapsed. So we really believe that to avoid this and to prevent this, to work in peacetime with other governments, with other authorities, with other communities, with other volunteers organizations in, let's say, developing countries would be essential to have common project in building capacity for disaster relief, for disaster management. So it's in the paper, and we strongly believe that this is one of the no conflict area in which we can cooperate, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi, and thanks to you all. I wouldn't dare to try to summarize the discussion, but just maybe 3 points to conclude. The first one is, I heard this morning that principles are ideological luggage. Yeah, maybe, absolutely, I concur to that, but beyond that, what I take home from these discussions and from the panelists is that there are also tools to ensure that we can do our work. And I think it's important that we also keep that in mind. The second thing is that on the aspect on politicization, instrumentalization of aid, I think it's important that we remain as a humanitarian community watchful of any development. I've noticed with interest the change of name of the commissioner, the EU commissioner, who is now called Commissioner for Humanitarian and Crisis Management, which is a bit at odds to me with the principles we've been discussing earlier today. So I would encourage all of us to be watchful of how this situation will evolve. And finally, a big thank you to you, Luigi. I think you use the term families and how there's a need for us to better understand each other. I think your simple fact that you are there demonstrates that you're willing to educate us, and hopefully it goes the other way around. This is something which I take home with me. I get a sense that I better understand the situation, and I also understand that we have maybe two families. You use animals. I think I prefer families. Two families, but I think none of these families are into forced marriage. We are more into a discussion and a dialogue, and I think it's great that way. So big thank you to the three of you. Thanks to you. The audience, and I think it's time for a break.